ви кажа добре дошли за някои от вас отново на къщата за литература и превод, за други от вас за първи път. Много се радвам, че това стана, че тази среща стана по Tzveta Sofronieva и Levchev, по стените на къщата може да видите работи, които комбинират визуални работи на Иван Кюранов с стихотворение на Tzveta Sofronieva от един проект, за който може би Денис самата Tzveta ще не се каже повече. За мен е удоволствие да ви представя Денис Малонey. С нощи беше премиерата на неговата първа и за сега единствена книга на български език. Затворени на Микеланджело, правил на Tzveta Sofronieva и втората книга на издателство ФО. Thomas, sorry, I'll sum it up for you later. Yeah, well, I thought it doesn't matter of course. You're speaking Bulgarian, but okay.
It's a Bulgarian institution.
To cut it short, welcome to the Sofia Literature and Translation.
No, I'm not talking to the introduction. Everybody understands English, then you won't have to interpret it.
It's part of positive nationalism, because you go to your institute, they'll never talk Bulgarian, so even if Bulgarian writers.
I'm afraid I don't even have a positive nationalism.
I'm just kidding, come on. I'd like to excuse ourselves. So I can talk English.
Talking about isms as a way of introducing Dennis as well. Allow me just for a second to tell you a personal story from about 5 years ago, when I was in the States on a job shadowing at Open Letter Books, a prominent publisher of translations. And I was in the small city of Rochester, and I went for coffee with a local guy.
It's not that small.
Well, there is no public transportation, so I know of Rochester what I could see around the campus. Anyway, so I went for coffee at the hotel veranda with an American businessman, and we were having some casual conversation, and at some point he looked at me. There was nothing about politics in that conversation. He looked at me and he said, that was Obama's times, early Obama's times. He looked at me and said, "Ah, you're an internationalist, just like our president." And first of all, I never heard that word in English before. I haven't heard that word for 30 years.
Before or after?
And then the very notion of somebody being an internationalist.
You could be a ruthless cosmopolitan.
Yes, that's what he said. So we have in the house tonight a ruthless cosmopolitan, an internationalist in post-Obama times. Dennis, alongside being a poet and a translator from Spanish language poetry, he's also a publisher. He established them 45 years ago, 1973. The independent press, White Pine Press in Buffalo, US. As a Sofia Literature and Translation House, you know that we are trying to be a kind of an international hub for literary communication. And we are hosting not only translators and writers, but also international publishers who are hoping that they will get interested in contemporary Bulgarian literature as well. Then I haven't asked that question to Dennis yet, but you can feel free to ask afterwards whether he got interested in Bulgarian literature, having been here for a few days already. As almost everything in international publishing and in translations, the fact of Dennis being here is actually due to personal networks. And it's thanks to Tzveta Sofronieva and to their creative connections between the two of them. Vladimir Levchev, as the cliche goes, is not going to be presented. We have some of his translations and just two of his over there. The most recent, this is the most recent one, is it?
Which one?
The No Lubov to Pushta.
Not actually most recent, but mine.
Relatively recent.
I
Compared to the other
60, I
25.
had this selected. Which was 2 years ago.
The most recent.
Yeah, that's
It's
the
my
most recent.
copy, but I can put it so that links. Okay.
Yeah, I trust, we all trust Vlado and Dennis for an intriguing, challenging conversation about publishing the literary scene in the US, if there is a literary scene, a single literary or a single poetry scene at all in the US. And then, of course, you can ask questions, and then we can have an informal conversation over wine. And you can have the wine even now if you want. So, yes.
Yeah. Well, it is really my pleasure and honor to be invited to moderate this discussion, although I think Jana could have done it very well herself. But still, and everyone speaks English here, so you don't need any translation, we'll speak English. Dennis Maloney is, first of all, a poet, of course, and a publisher of poetry, not only of poetry, but also translator and also architect, which is interesting. We'll talk about this. And his small press is actually, I knew it before we met, because there are not so many publishers in the United States who are dedicated to mostly poetry and kind of literature that is not, that doesn't make money, let's put it this way. And I can just read for you the first paragraph of the introduction to the website of White Pine Press. White Pine Press is a non-profit literary publisher established in 1973, which publishes poetry, fiction, essays, and literature in translation from around the world. For the past 30 years, we have been at the forefront in bringing the rich diversity of world literature to the English-speaking audience. We seek to enrich our literary heritage, to promote the cultural awareness, understanding, and respect so vital in our rapidly changing world. So, yeah, first of all, of course, Dennis Maloney is a poet, and I would like to start with a question about you as a poet. But first, poetry and translation, in my opinion, first of all, translation of poetry is the most difficult thing, and if it's possible at all, and we will talk about this too. And as Robert Frost said, it's poetry is what is lost in the translation, although it's worth it, and I think it's not always lost. But first, writing poetry itself, I think, is in a way a translation, because you have, especially lyrical poetry, where usually, basically, it's about personal emotions or some abstract aesthetic ideas that exists in us, and then they have to be verbalized, to be translated in some language. So there is something, I think, some similarity between poetry and translation.
Yes.
But I would like to start with some questions about you as a poet.
Sure.
I guess you started writing poetry before you became a translator or publisher.
Yes. I first became a poet when I was a freshman in college. I heard the American poet Robert Bly, who many of you may know, read, and I had not written really any poetry before that, maybe a couple high school exercises, and just got inspired to start writing poetry and reading his poetry. And as I read his poetry, he was also a translator, and publisher, so I owe all three professions to him in a way, and I started translating a little bit of Spanish poetry with 2 years of high school Spanish in a big dictionary. And then I found it easier later to work with a collaborator who spoke the language much better than I, and what I worked on was making them into good poems in English. And what you mentioned in your introductory remarks is poetry as a form of translation. Octavia Paz said something along that line of poetry is translating the world. Yeah. And let me just read one in comment to your Robert Frost analogy. Alistair Reid, who's Scottish, but was both a poet in his own right, but also a translator in Neruda and a lot of other poets from Latin America. And I have a quote of his that I use as an epigraph in a series that I did. And it talks about Robert Frost's line, "I keep translating words into other words, which are mine. Who do these words belong to? Writer, translator, poet, or to the language itself? For lovers or users of words, this is the difficulty. What gets lost is not what gets lost in translation, but more what gets lost in the language itself." And I think that's a very good response to.
Well, by the
Frosty
way,
was not a translator.
would you mind reading some more of your poetry? Although you had this reading yesterday, but I think many of some of you were not there yesterday, so it would be good for them to hear some more of your poetry, which was translated in Bulgarian by Tzveta Sofronieva, but also in German, right?
Yeah.
So you have two bilingual books here, one English-German and one Bulgarian
Why
English.
it is
No,
a story.
Bulgarian only, yeah.
It's a mythology.
Oh yes, it's Bulgarian only. I'm sorry, yes. So
First book of mine I can't read.
yeah. So well, crossing borders. The first 4 parts, I think they're good. I mean, poems about, well, they're short parts. Poems about, or one poem, of course, about the geography of language, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the one you wrote
And
with
which
Robert
has
Frost,
the
my poem about
translation.
translation.
Okay, I'll read several from Border Crossings, which grew out of coming to Europe about 3 or 4 years ago for a festival, and then just looking at it, was just the beginning of the Syrian refugee migration into Europe, and I was at a festival where there's all these languages swirling around, which is Jose Oliver's festival. We gather in the Black Forest to explore the boundaries, borders of language, a border that is always wandering, sometimes east, west. We never know exactly where, always vanishing, breaking, maybe inside ourselves. Listening intently, I try to follow the patterns, cadence of speech, alive in the air, and strange to the ear. In conversation and poetry, we struggle to find the right words through jolts and swerves of syntax, complexities of exchange, the extravagance of lost syllables. Sometimes language borders are permeable, where breath itself is a conscious action that travels across languages and joins us together. 3. In the capitals and squares of Europe, people gather to support the Falun Gong refugees fleeing Syria and victims of the genocide in Armenia. Under the Brandenburg Gate, they celebrate the World Cup win. I hear the rare chant of Hare Krishna, almost an extinct species in America. In the dark shadows of the nights of broken glass re-emerge, as the persecuted are confused with the persecutors, and marches and rallies against all that is foreign stream into the night. A dictionary is 4. A dictionary explodes, sending words fleeing towards the borders, chased by those without name towards a great unknown destination. Words are refugees smuggled in hidden train compartments, walking obscure paths through farm fields, forests, washing up dead on shores, lost at sea, crawling under fences and over walls built to keep them out. Words are on a clandestine voyage, seeking asylum in an unknown language, their passports thick from collecting official stamps over the centuries. One cannot overestimate the amount of accumulated baggage. 5. On the dark nights when I have no words of my own, translation calms me, lets me jump deep in, letter by letter, soaking up the dampness of the words. I hear a whispered sigh like the sea in the dark, as both poem and self exist in a constant state of becoming. What draws us as a translator to seek an equivalent music from one tongue to another, affinities of vibrancy, listening to the meanings that reside flowering beyond the thickness of dictionaries. Nibbling at the edges of the poem, we give contours to shadows. How do we translate the silence that lives between the lines? I am a nomad searching for a language in which I am a word unbound, wandering between the world we inhabit and the one that we create. And that poem came out of the last poem came out of a dialogue between myself and Tzveta in email. And just to back up, I owe my presence in Bulgaria to Tzveta's energy. We first came in contact, we published a series called the Cliff Becker Prize for a book of poetry and translation. It's an open contest and translators submit the work, and Tzveta's was the first one chosen by Willis Barnstone as a very prominent American translator and publisher. Or translator and poet, sorry. And we didn't know each other. She was picked by a judge, and when we started corresponding about her book, which is now 6 or 7 years ago, we found an affinity with our both poetries and started talking back and forth about our work. And she had discovered my work when she was in Boston, unbeknownst to me, when she was on a fellowship. So she already knew of our house, and we have some mutual friends, European poets that we had published previous, Magda Carnecci from Romania and Dennis Dennis from Slovenia. So we have now a friendship that's many years old. Let me just see, this was 2008, no, 2012, so yeah, 7 years. But we met just through her winning the prize, and then started forming a friendship back and forth, and we both were at a festival in Lenzlez in Bavaria, which is where that sequence starts. And she had translated some of my poems for the festival, and there Hans Schiller, a publisher, was there and said if he was interested in the poems, and if she would do a book that he would publish. So.
And I'm used every 10 years to come to Bulgaria and bring one of my publishers. Last time I brought Michael Krüger, and 20 or so many years ago I brought John Potant. So from all languages I usually try it when I come. So it's also good to bring friends here.
Schwarzwald was where the Danube springs, right?
Schwarzwald is the border.
That's what I remember from geography in school.
Well, no, Leselenz is in Hausach, which is very near to Strasbourg. So it's not on a river, it's in the hills. And it's a city maybe like, I don't know,
it means Black
like
Forest,
a Polonia,
right?
maybe it's comparable, the festival that José Oliver. José Oliver also will be translated. He comes for the first time in Bulgaria to Kennedy House in this October. Special origin author, very, very good. Very interesting author.
I was thinking about language and landscape, and because there is one essay, wrote an essay on translation, in which it's like a Platonic dialogue, and one of the interlocutors claims that poetry, that poetry cannot be translated. And translation is impossible at all. And he says, for example, let's say a Spanish poet writes a poem about a forest, which is bosque, right? And then a German poet translates it, and it will be Wald, right? But for a Spaniard, when he hears bosque, he will probably imagine an olive grove or orange grove, and a German will imagine, I guess, a pine forest in the Alps. So how can we translate bosque with forest? These are different things.
I guess a different kind of forest, but I think at least like, for example, I've translated Antonio Machado, the Spanish poet, the whole book Campos de Castilla, which in Spanish literally translates field of Castile. But I translated it as landscape of Castile because for me in English the word landscape involves much more than the fields themselves, because he's involved with the people of the region and everything embodied in the region. So, and you were talking before, my profession I retired from was a landscape architect rather than a building architect. So I feel that the vocabulary, because part of my training was learning the names of trees and learning different things about the landscape, that it gave me a particular vocabulary that informed when I translated something like Machado, having a more robust American vocabulary to try to bring the Spanish into English. And I can see where you would say, okay, everybody's concept of the forest is going to be different, but it still is. I mean, I think you can still get the image of what he's trying to convey in the case of him.
Yeah, of course, this is kind of paradoxical and extreme, but as an architect by profession, you've practiced architecture.
Yeah, I was a landscape architect, yes.
Landscape, yes, yes.
I,
So
for 35 years, worked for the city of Buffalo, where I lived, doing parks and playgrounds and open space. So, and thankfully, at 55, I got a very nice pension, so I was able to retire and go to poetry full-time. Poetry publishing, translation, as you said in your introduction, do not make any money. So in America, you need a vocation other than that to sort of make a living at, unless you're a professor or something of English or something.
So basically, you started White Pine Press about the same time, or a little later?
After I graduated college.
Yeah. And you started writing when you were in college?
In college, yes. So yeah, 1973 I started.
Yeah. Well, three professions that. Oh, by the way, talking about visual arts and poetry, why the Prisoners of Michelangelo?
Well, it's a poem that I wrote about obviously the four statues that are in Florence.
Yeah.
And I had been to Europe, to Italy several times and had seen them, and they always intrigued me because all of the other pieces are very fine and finished, and those pieces always intrigued me because they were unfinished. So, and it took me many years to sort of think about the relationship and that they were slaves, and it's sort of, you know, the image of pulling themselves out of the rock. And part of the poem came later when I found that Michelangelo was gay, although obviously not announced at the time, but he would watch the young men quarrying the rock, you know, so that became another kind of image that fed into the poem.
Yes, in your poetry, visual imagery is kind of leading, I think, right? It's very, and such poetry is, in my opinion, easier to translate. It doesn't mean that it's easier poetry always. I mean, it's some of the greatest poetry ever written is visual, of course. But if poetry is more musical, if it pays more attention to the music of language than the imagery, then isn't it very difficult to translate?
I think it was difficult to bring that side of the poetry into another language.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some people do, like Tzveta and I were at a festival in Bucharest last week, and somebody has translated, I forget the sort of poet of... okay. Whose poetry is very rhymed, and we went to
translation into English now.
And he was able to find rhymes in English. Yeah. To do it, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's probably the first translation in English that brings across the music of that poet into English, and it's using different rhyme schemes.
And music and
content, yeah, and
it's really translation for this.
So it is very difficult, and some in my translations I've not tried to do that because I don't feel I have the skill to do that. And a lot of old translations from, say, the 40s or 50s in America were done in iambic pentameter, which is a British rhyme scheme, and I would see, like, some of the early Chinese translations that were done in iambic pentameter, and it doesn't fit the work at all, but that was the style of prosody in the States at the time.
It's a very complicated matter what you choose when you translate poetry. Do you go more for the form or for the content if you cannot do both really very well? If it doesn't work in the other language, it's very difficult decision. And I know that everybody was sometimes when I read translation of Brodsky into German, they look like they are very kind of artificial, and it's not
But-
him. And when you talk with the guys who translate it, they all the time say it's perfect, it has to be the form, because for Brodsky the form was the most important, but in Russian form exists in a different way than in English. In English from rhyme it doesn't work today in content. In Russian it works because of the language. And then it's so kind of, I don't know, raped poetry. And he himself said if they cannot make the form, it's better that the thoughts are there. So it's not that he insisted.
Well,
So it's very, I mean, what do you do when you translate?
by the way, talking about Brodsky, in my opinion, his poetry in Russian sounds much better than in English.
I mean, yes, he doesn't really like.
Although he has great essays written in English, but poetry in Russian sounds much better.
I could ask you a
But
question.
it's really hard because we can't hear.
Okay, I would like to ask you a question, because we were chatting last night, you translated T.S. Eliot, very formal poet, Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, so what do you do? That was my question, what
How
does?
do you approach both of them and translating to Bulgarian?
Now, I started translating Allen Ginsberg when I was in my 20s, in the early 1980s, when actually I love big poetry and in general, and this kind of free verse, first thoughts and stuff that exactly Ginsberg's poetry was something that influenced me at that time. However, throughout the 1980s, things changed, and this conservative renaissance probably influenced, which was also a cultural, not only political, and I was not very conservative politically, and never. But at the end of the 80s, I think I was more interested in T.S. Eliot and
Which poem of T.S. Eliot?
Sorry?
What of Eliot did you translate?
All of it.
Most of it. The quartets, from the love song of Geoffrey Prufrock to four quartets and Wasteland, all those things that, I mean, there are not so many.
No, the reason is that I teach in a community college in New York for many years, and we have to, it's an introduction to literature. So we have to have prose, drama, and poetry. So I always use The Wasteland. And Dennis Donahue told me once, the best way to read The Wasteland is to listen to it.
Yeah.
So then you listen to it, you hear the feelings and whatnot, and you go around the room and ask kids which line catches them. And then there's the problem with the languages. You know, all the different languages in the poem. And students says, well, Professor, that's just like walking down Broadway in New York. You know, you hear language after language, and you know, why shouldn't poems have all the languages? And also that was, and then the question of Eliot has, you know, the footnotes at the end. So Professor said, well, Professor, you're always telling us you have to put footnotes on it, because otherwise we get accused of stealing. And anyway, Professor, this is just sampling. Don't you get it? It's just rap music. You just and so this is like, these are people who do not read poetry. They usually in their essays about the history of their reading and writing, that's the one subject they dread more than anything, is poetry. You know, they'll tell you, you know, but those details about the sampling, suddenly that Eliot knows that. You know,
But Eliot was also one of the people who loved quantum mechanics, and Pound, and he decided, Pound was doing the particle part and Eliot was doing the wave part. And it was very conscious. So I'm very curious, what is your decision when you translated? I mean, sorry, but Dennis is for sure happy that we use him being here discussing all things like that, because it's very interesting how you take decisions, how you took decisions when you're translating into Bulgarian.
Talking about sampling and the wasteland, that was great, yes. And also intertextuality today is something kind of very easy with Google. It was not so easy in those days. I remember when I was translating Eliot in Ginsberg in the 80s, there is a poem called Saturgate Illumination. And I had no idea what Saturgate is. And I asked some of the best, Vladimir Levchev was still alive, and Nikolai Popov, who went to America later, nobody could tell me what this was. And there was no Google, and no way to ask Ginsberg himself in those days, early 80s, no communication through the Iron Curtain. So basically I didn't know what to do. And then in the 90s, I just, when Google appeared, I Googled it, and it turned out to be a gate in Berkeley, in the campus of Berkeley, which, I mean, if you haven't been there, how could you know?
Was that the first thing you ever Googled?
I don't remember. It's quite possible.
So did you really wait for Google to appear?
Google showed me the picture. Not only, you know, even if I was illiterate, I would have...
What did you do with Neruda, Dennis, when you did with, I mean, Neruda is also very much in form, and Spanish function is also very much like Russian or some other language. It's possible to do modern poetry. The language allows to do it in a form that much worse in English.
Well, I think Neruda intentionally simplified his style.
Yeah, and I've translated, I did not translate the early poems that are more surreal.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done mostly the landscape poems that are on Isla Negra. So it was more when he changed the style. I did a couple poems that were at the end of the residence, and those are a little more, you know, have to work with my co-translator a little bit to pull out the meaning sometimes.
Yeah,
And when working with a co-translator, she would, a woman who's I worked with, if I as a poet got too far away from the original, she would sort of pull me back in and say, it doesn't quite say that, you know, so you can't, you know, because you're looking for a poetic image to capture, you know, and sometimes we go back and forth to, you know, subtly arrange it. It would usually just be a line or two in a poem.
Although in translating poetry, literal translation is not the best.
No. Yeah. But she would keep me honest, so to speak. I wouldn't go too far away.
If I tried this to put one of Ivan Vazov's poems in Google Translator. It's funny. It's a really funny one. I mean, Google cannot translate poetry, definitely.
Or it makes
Still, at least still.
Very, very abstract.
I like that. You should run it through a couple of languages and see what happens.
Well, that has been done actually before Google. And it's usually, if you translate the poem into actually in those days, in my time, in Bulgaria, most translators were kind of the Russian school, and they would, of course, translate everything with a lot of rhymes, even if there's no rhyme in the original. And also, very often, it would say that it's translation from Farsi, for example, actually it's translation from Russian. And it happened so that, you know, Rubaiyat, Omar Khan's Rubaiyat, was translated in such a way that the same Rubaiyat was translated several times, and it was completely different text, because the translator who claimed that translates from Farsi actually translated from Russian, and Russians sometimes Russian translators also you know I mean their translations are more like interpretations of the of the original, rhyming very much, very beautiful language. So he didn't realize that he's translating the same way from different translations. And in Bulgarian had nothing to do, nothing in common, you know. So I'm saying, yes, this is the other extremity. The literal translation, Google doesn't work. But if you start paying too much attention to the, you know, to the rhymes and stuff, you can just lose the meaning, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Which in most cases still is more important than the music. The music you can imitate, but you can't translate it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very difficult.
This debate was actually all began by actually Ezra Pound, because Ezra Pound is the one that makes translation really essential in American literature. And Ezra Pound and then Eliot and William Carlos Williams, because then poetry in America splits, and they all seem to forget Pound, the Pound era, and then the academic poets come along. And there were, in the 60s, there were two competing anthologies. There was the Donald Allen anthology, which I've read, just like you, that's what you read Kerouac and Ginsberg and Jack Spicer, and these people. Then there was this thing called the Pack, and these are people like Merwin and James Merrill, all the ones who were going to get Pulitzer Prizes one after another.
More the farm
They were giving Pulitzer Prizes to each other, and then there was the others, you know.
The factory,
The outlaws of the academic.
Yeah, and it was very fierce, and there was very few. The only person I ever knew who tried to merge them was a man named Chad Walsh, who taught at Beloit, and he liked the idea of having the contrast, of course, you know. But that wasn't usual the way it was. You either chose one or the other. And I'm sure that duplicates itself here in Bulgaria too, the formalist versus more.
Followers of Pound and the followers of William Carlos Williams, I guess, who in the beginning were together in the Imagist movement.
But the point is, what do you think, or what Dennis thinks it would be a question, right? Do you really need today to have the same type of, it depends of course on the language, but do you need to have these forms? Because if you look at the development of poetry started as transferring knowledge to children with rhymes and sequences that allow like the brain is structured, that you can memorize because it's 3 seconds of a brain structure that perceives as now present, and everything else is past or future. So you can memorize this, and then there was no written poetry, so poetry on Greek or much of it had to be like this. And then when the written books came, poetry changed, of course, and you had different. And then with the modernists, when they had, especially, I wonder that the German modernists never used the whole quantum mechanics, relativity theory, genetics, and so on in there, but Eliot Pound exactly. They used. We have this beautiful book by Albright in Harvard Quantum Poetics, and it shows that they really consciously used the latest knowledge of natural sciences and social sciences doing poetry, and then we have now a completely different time again. So the poetry goes from this giving knowledge of former times with certain forms, and then more kind of more volume, in one volume, more and more information and knowledge and feelings and context. So it doesn't need to be anymore. It has, like, I love this by Vladimir Levchev definition of writing, that he has a poem when he says that everybody writes what he hears, and everybody hears the way he breathes. So there are different rhythms of breathing for different people. So when you have the breathing in a poem, and a different, and if you try to say this is also a rhythm. And the fact that somebody breathes a little bit differently and has different rhythm in the poem doesn't always mean that it's no form, which is in the rhythm poetic rhythm. So it's very, for me it's very interesting what you do, what you
I actually
translate.
was thinking of that because on the plane last night I was reading an essay by Mandelstam on the addressee, to whom is poetry written. And that's one of the, it's a very short essay. It finally comes down to understanding that it's attempting to convey a personal feeling to that distant reader 100 years from now. Because then he points out the different types of poetry. There's the poetry that accuses somebody, or the poems that have this direct address at someone, like poems celebrating Stalin, poems celebrating something. What he was thinking is that the very greatest poems are written far out of their time. They're written to this imaginary person in the future. And he talks about a poet named Belmont, I think it is, who writes this very simple poem about someone who's going to have the same feelings. And I was just taken by that because that struck me as what happens like in New York or whatnot. They're the poems that respond to contemporary events. And so, but something has to be more than a contemporary event for it to survive. And that's what is the difficult.
Well, to go back to Dennis. I mean, Dennis has, for example, very different form depending from what he's talking about. If he talks something about Far East, and he comes from Buddhism, and he comes from Zen Buddhism, not some Buddhism, but from Zen. And all his experiences from Kyoto, and he can tell more, of course, but then the poems are tankas, and they are very clear in form of a Far East. When he talks American stories, American feelings, American sensuality, he has a very kind of free verse, we would say, very short lines, and longer poems with short lines, sometimes one word. And when he has a European theme, as he read, he has this European, classical European style, longer 6 and then 6 or 8 lines. And so it is very much depending, that's what I say with the Kujava, what I like in this expression with the breathing, it's depending, also you breathe differently, you walk differently, different rhythm, different feeling and form, when you're in different places and you have different topics and you have, so we are in a time, I don't know, tell more about how do you write all this, because you change form a lot.
So let's do it one by one. There are too many things.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, of course, and whatever. If you want to start with answering her question, or maybe you were talking about the addressee, and we first were talking about the European sense of Neruda, right? This is where we started from.
Yeah.
And Neruda did change his addressee quite substantially. He's known for his poetry that was addressed to common people,
Right.
trying to be the Chilean Walt Whitman, or
Well, I think he was very influenced by Whitman, and he was, the change came really during the Spanish Civil War when he was ambassador to Spain. And he wrote during the fall of the Republic, and he was writing poems in support of the Republic, and then helped a lot of people emigrate. He gave visas to everybody to get a lot of people out of the country. But I think the experience in the war and then coming back, and he was obviously also a communist, which didn't help some of his poetry because he wrote some very bad political dribble, basically, in support of Stalin and other things, which we have to, I guess, forgive him for a bit. Although it depends, you know, but he's, some of that has been translated into English, some not, because I think some is just not worth translating as opposed to the bulk of his other work. But I think he was, I mean, except for the Stalin period, I think in Latin America, the poets were looked at, he was more of a socialist than a communist, in the sense that fighting against the dictatorships, he was sort of trying to support the common people, and part of his poetry was to try to address this audience.
Yeah. But actually, these are the poems that are best known by him.
Yes, yeah.
This period. And how, I mean, this is quite different type of poetry that you are also interested in, which Tzveta mentioned too. For instance, and Japanese poetry, I guess you say that Gary Snyder probably influenced you to getting interested into the Far East, but can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, well, he was certainly one of my mentors, and like I said before, Robert Bly fell into Latin American and European poetry, and he would, like, for example, Bly was doing Thomas Tranströmer or Neruda, Cesar Vallejo, Machado, so I read all of those poets because of Bly. In the case of Snyder, he brought me to Japanese and Chinese poetry, of which obviously there's a several thousand-year tradition. And the one sequence in the Bulgarian book called Just Enough, I just set a discipline for myself because I was familiar with the time form. I just set it as a 5-line form. I didn't use the syllabicon of the Japanese because I'm not really keen on using a count of syllabicon from one language in another. But I just used the 5-line form as a discipline to writing, to try and write in. I like the spareness of the Japanese and the compression. That, I mean, that's what I sort of learned from Japanese and Chinese poetics was they leave something in the imagination where the reader fills in, somehow becomes part of the poem. It's sort of like the landscape paintings where there's a lot of mistiness and open space, and it sort of is to draw the reader into that. And so that was just a discipline for one collection. That's what I was saying with the border crossing sequence. I think that just had a different language that sort of, established itself as I was writing it, and it goes in different places, and it was one of the sequences I didn't know where it was going, and just was doing sections, and then sort of it got a form as I finished it, but I didn't know at the beginning, there was a couple poems that I didn't know how I would sequence them and where it would end up, because it ends up with a poem about my great-grandparents came from Ireland, and I went back and reclaimed my Irish citizenship, so I'm now a dual citizen.
Actually, now some British people also claim Irish citizenship for other reasons.
Yes, yes, for the,
Yes,
yes.
not because of became Irish.
Northern
because of
Ireland,
whatever.
yes, yeah, of course, yeah, because of Brexit and all that.
Gary Snyder has some very nice American haiku. Haiku, which is obviously not the same as the Japanese haiku.
Right.
Because haiku, of course, is not only 17 syllables, 3 lines. It's that it has to be about nature and about season.
And he would not call his stuff. He refuses to call his poems haiku, actually. But
and how about your interest in tanka? Did you, other than being 5 lines, what are? I don't know this very well. That's why I'm asking.
Well, it's the haiku is actually 3 lines out of the 5-line tanka.
Yeah, yeah.
And I, for whatever reason, can't write in that form. It's too short for me. So the tanka, I think, carries the same feeling as that. A lot of times involving nature, sometimes not, but the ideas of the compression and the being imagistic, for the most part.
Yeah. All right. Then let's talk a little bit about publishing. Poetry and translation, because you also, much of what you're publishing is actually translation.
Yes, about half of what we publish every year is literary translation.
So, how do you survive as a small press, which is not easy? And,
no. Well, as I think we started with, it's where your opening remarks, we're a non-profit, and most of our support comes from some support in America from government funding, private foundations, and then the translated literature that we do, we're now somewhere between 25 to 30 languages from around the world. We've done a lot from Latin America, Asia, both Eastern and Western Europe. Many countries thankfully have some sort of subvention programs for translation and or publication, so we've been able to utilize that to help get some funding to pay the translator and pay for maybe some of the publication costs.
how about the American writers who are not?
American writers, we generally get support from the state of New York, where we live, has a good arts council. We go to the National Endowment for the Arts, and then have a few private donors that occasionally give us some funds to help.
So still there is state funds for arts.
Yes, for culture and arts.
Most people think that no, that's something European, you know. But
well, it depends on our government, like our current, not my president, who tries to get rid of the National Endowment for the Arts, but thankfully, the way our system is balanced, our Congress is able to refuse to do that. So, and particularly now that the Democrats have power in one house, it's much better for us.
Yeah. So you publish not only poetry but fiction and essays too. Do you have any kind of thematic preferences? Or just
we don't do too much in essays. We've done a couple occasionally. Like we just did a book of Robert Bly's important essays. We've done previously a couple books of his poetry, and he was a mentor to me. So and his family actually came and said we would do the collection of essays, which were mainly from the 60s and 70s, when he had a magazine that was very influential in American poets, because he was one of the first ones to sort of bring American poetry out of the academic writing of the, say, 40s and 50s, and start bringing influences of foreign poetry into American poetry, which really had a big change in the way many American poets wrote. So the book is of his seminal essays. In fiction, we don't do American fiction. At one time we did some, but we're not big enough to market it easily. But we do in some of our series, like we do a series from Korean literature. Some of that we do contemporary fiction, along with contemporary poetry.
Yeah.
And we do, and from some other countries we do, like from Latin America, we've done some novels and short stories. It just depends on people, because a lot of projects come to us because people know we're a translation house, and professors will suggest, or people that we publish will suggest other volumes to us by their fellow translators. So a lot of it is by networking between people that we know and people that are friends of theirs in particular languages, because we have to rely on outside readers because we don't know all the languages that we publish, so we need to go to somebody who can advise us on who the poet is, fiction writer is in that language, and how they're looked at in their mother culture.
Yeah, I can see that you publish some anthologies too. For example, short fiction by Mexican women. Is Vladimir the editor, or I can see her name here.
Marjorie Augustine was the editor.
Yeah, but is Vladimir is mentioned too? No,
Isabel Allende is in one of the authors.
Okay.
Is the poet Marjorie? The poet Marjorie?
Yeah. She got some woman, Latin American woman series. Because Marjorie Augustine's a Chilean poet who actually even though she's been in America since college age, is a few years younger than I am, writes in Spanish because she says her inspiration is in Spanish, and then even though she speaks Jewish,
family,
but her family happened to be in the United States when Allende was overthrown, so they stayed here because they were on the side of Allende. But she came to us at one point. We'd been publishing her poetry and said, when the boom happened, the Latin American boom, all the male authors were published, but none of the females were. So we started a series called the Secret Weaver series to bring all the women writers who were many of whom were well known in their own culture, including people like Gabrielle Mistral, who won the Nobel Prize, she was present in some English, but not in very good translations. But then we brought many other more contemporary poets and fiction writers into English in America.
You have this Gabriel Mistral reader here, right?
Yes.
And, so it was who edited it? One of the translators, or?
Marjorie Augustine helped edit it, was a series editor, and then she worked with the translators who did the translation.
Maybe Manuel, as publisher, has some questions?
Yeah, did you sell all around the country? All around America?
Yeah, on Amazon. We were distributed by a group called Consortium, and they represent 100-some publishers, mainly literary and social political publishers. So because they're all small publishers, but they have enough clout to sell to Amazon and to what chains are left in America. I mean, when I started 45 years ago, it was only independent bookstores.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in America, we had Barnes & Noble and Borders, the two big chains that came.
Still.
Well, Borders is gone now. Borders has disappeared. Barnes & Noble is still, but then they were sort of taken over by Amazon now, who's the biggest bookseller in America. In the independent, we lost about half of the independent bookstores in America. But now the ones that survived, the one chain is gone and the other is selling less books and selling more cafe or notebooks or CDs or video. So the independents that have survived are making a strong comeback. But Amazon is a source, like our consortium, the group that represents us, over half their sales are to Amazon now. So Amazon has sort of taken over a large part of the book business in America. Thankfully in Bulgaria you don't have Amazon yet, so independent bookstores can survive hopefully for a long time.
In Washington DC, there was this Politics and Prose.
I know that I've been in the store, yeah, it's still there.
It's still there, yes, they survive.
Yeah.
But mostly, I guess, because they sell coffee to not only books.
Well, many bookstores in America are like Desi's set up a cafe and bookstore. And
what are the typical print runs? Sorry for that.
That's okay, yeah. Well, for us, our typical print runs are 500 to 1,000 books. Depending on, now that we have digital printing, we don't do the single on demand so much, but if something sells out, we can easily print 200 or 300 more copies, so it makes it managing our inventory much better. Because in the old days, when we only had offset, we pretty much had to print 1,000 copies to get a decent price. But sometimes if the book didn't sell, we'd end up with 500, 600, 700 copies in the warehouse, and then our distributor charges the book sitting in the warehouse of 5 months, so it became very expensive. So now
How
with
many
digital printing,
titles per year?
we usually do 10 to 12.
And how many people work for you?
Myself and my wife, actually. And we do almost everything in-house.
Everybody else is
And
freelance.
friends, yeah, we have some freelancers, yeah.
And from your catalog, which of the books that you published would you consider the most successful in either market terms or long seller or in terms of?
Well, in terms of sales, several books we've done by Robert Bly. We've done a African-American poet, Sonia Sanchez. One of her books was out of print. She's a very well-known, probably in her 80s now, African-American poet. We picked up one of her books from the 70s that had been out of print for some reason, because we'd done some poems of hers in an anthology. And that book is, even as a reprint, is sold about 6,000 copies, which for us is huge.
So how long?
Maybe
Since
about
the 80s.
7 or 10 years. And, some of our other books, I mean, these days, if I sell 1,500 or 2,000, that's for us is a very good seller. And we've had some success over the years doing that. But I would say our typical book sells maybe 500 to 700 copies over time, because you have an initial sale in America, and then you hope, particularly with the translator literature, that it gets picked up by some professors for courses. And then sometimes they will order year after year because they like the book, or they'll change. Like, say we do a lot of Korean literature, they may order some books 1 year and then look at our list and pick other books or something.
Did
Or
you
for
have some
Spanish.
more chance journal when the Nobel Prize came?
No, our book is unfortunately out of print and been reprinted by New Directions already.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
What about public libraries?
You had it first.
Public libraries are purchasing?
Yes, public libraries and university libraries, yes. But the sales of those were much more robust maybe 20, 30 years ago, because everybody's budgets get cut. So they buy the best sellers, they buy what the people who come to the library will read more of. So poetry is not often difficult. University libraries may be more because they have they have good English departments, many, so they want to have, or maybe Spanish studies or Asian studies, so they will buy accordingly for their student population.
And it's interesting about libraries, because in one of the local libraries that I go to in New Jersey, it was a Peter Handke novel comes out, the Austrian writer, published by Farrar Straus. And it gets nice reviews, and it never shows up in the libraries. And I'll go in and it'll be, I won't even pick any popular writer, there'll be 5 copies. Whatever popular writer, I don't want to give any of those people publicity. But the fact is, I said, well, why? He said, well, the budget's based upon circulation. And they don't care about the titles, they care how many books leave the library. And so therefore, whatever those writers are, they'll get 5 or 6 copies of that. But they even rent them, though. They don't even buy them, they rent them. And I always say, you can't even give them away now to the thrift stores, to the Goodwill. They don't want any of these books anymore. And so, this is the local libraries, At one time, local libraries used to read Library Journal, and they said, because they had this idea that libraries should be teaching people something. Now, thanks to it was a librarian from Baltimore who, at the ALA in the 1980s, said bookstores, libraries should be more like Barnes and Noble. They should have spinning racks in the front. They should cater to the public. They shouldn't try to teach. That's very arrogant and elitist. And so that worked. Of course, the irony is in Baltimore, too, the most devastated city in America. They came up with that great idea. But anyway, that was devastating. Because then, how to judge the value of a library, you count the number of books that go out.
Now many of our libraries are computer terminals. They remove the books from computer terminals.
But it's really extremely sad if some years you were the best, the most, you published the most poetry from abroad. You had several years when your publishing house was publishing most books as poetry translations from abroad. And if you say these numbers of setting for the whole US, and maybe English Canada, then it's really
Yes,
really
yeah.
a very sad story.
That is the true story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was wondering about bilingual books, because here in Bulgaria it's kind of tricky with that. You have this German English, but what's your experience with?
Well, in our house, because, well, I mean, we've done some bilingual, but because our house is very small, I would rather have more of the poetry, particularly if it's a more obscure language. Like, we will do, Spanish would be the first one we would do bilingual, because that would be the most understandable language. There are other presses, publishers, Copper Canyon, for example, which is a very well-known American publisher of poetry, a non-profit, who has a budget probably 15 times our size. It's just a matter of their house policy that they do everything bilingually, even if it's Vietnamese or, say Bulgarian or something. And that's just their style and their house policy. But I would say most other publishers do it by the book and see what makes sense to them. I mean, we've done some, say, French bilingual. In the Cliff Becker series, which we do, this one is bilingual, because that's the style that was established for the product.
And yeah, so it's not like Spanish where you can find, you can find a lot of Bulgarian speaking. But yeah, my experience is that in America that's much more popular than in Bulgaria.
Absolutely, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, by the way, I was just going to say that here we have two writers who are also translators, and maybe they should ask some questions.
Well, my question was, I recently read somewhere that actually with the Trump administration in place, there's been a resurgence of poetry readings and actually people demanding more poetry, just because it's probably kind of a response to what's going on, and people trying to find a more private world away from the news and sort of and headlines and their Facebook feeds. So I just wanted to ask you, have you noticed a trend like that in the past 2 years?
I think I've noticed that there's many anti-Trump poems being written in anthologies coming out of. But I think it's a common experience that because I think we feel culture is under attack in America. But I think similar periods like during the Vietnam War and maybe during when America was supporting Nicaragua, the Contras, when America becomes very political, I think poetry seems to rise up a little bit and become more visible in the culture. I mean, I think we always have a certain core of people who like poetry, and there's variations. Like a lot of young people for a while, slam poetry was very big, which is sort of bringing poetry back to an oral art. And there's some people, I don't do Twitter and some of this other stuff, but apparently there's some very young poets, because one of my granddaughters knows about that. Other than that, I don't know, but there's some younger poets of that age that are selling lots of books because they're Twitter followers. That's not very good, to my mind, not very good poetry, but it's appealing to like maybe teenage girls or something. Yeah, so it's kind of, but I mean, if somebody comes through there and finds out what poetry is really about, then I would say fine. And in some communities, minority communities, poetry has become much more a way of expression. Like say African American, Hispanic, Asian American. There's a lot of new writing come out of these minority groups that didn't happen like 20, 30, 40 years ago. So you see a resurgence of poetry in a wide variety of communities. So it is. But yeah, I think it has been. I mean, I think there used to be, because I've been involved in poetry going on not quite 50 years. In the say 60s and 70s, there's more poetry readings going on than there are these days. I mean, there would be. In Buffalo, my city, for example, there would sometimes be 3 or 4 poetry readings a week in the 70s and 80s, but now that you have the internet and TV and movies and Netflix and the competition's become much more than there was in, say, the 70s. So people are attending less events, so they do less programming. And hopefully maybe more people are reading books, but...
What about translations? Traditionally, the States is the market with the least number of translations
Yes.
worldwide, but these days it seems they're going up percentage-wise.
Well,
Do you have observations? In
Well,
this?
Chad Post, who's a publisher who's, I guess, been here, and he publishes an online thing called 3%, which is about the figure that's usually quoted of translated literature published in America each year out of all the books. And then he would further go to say that serious literature, which we consider poetry, and fiction that we would consider serious fiction as opposed to pulp fiction or romance or something, is less than 1%. And the ratio is probably still true, but I think there's more of it being published because of non-profit houses like ours and university presses. Most of the translated literature is coming out of that.
But the number is growing?
I would say the number is growing a bit, but it's still a very small, negligible percentage. But yes, there's more being done than in when I started in the 70s, and there was much fewer publishers doing that. So there are many more publishers. I mean, we have, for example, New Directions, which was founded by James Laughlin on the advice of Ezra Pound, who when he went to see Ezra Pound, he said he wanted to be a poet, and Pound suggested he publish other writers rather than himself. And he did publish his own poetry in the end, but Pound introduced him to most of the European writers. So he published in the 40s and 50s many of the important European writers, who then got picked up by the Academy, and that's where, he started with $4 million because his father owned a steel company. So he had a lot of money backing, but he also became...
So it was not for profit?
Well, it's sort of not for profit,
speaking,
technically, yeah.
You cannot make...
But he became, he became profitable because of who he published, because of all the European and American names. But then, like, somebody mentioned Farrar, Straus and Giroux, who, of the New York houses, they've been bought by Bertelsmann or something now, but of the New York commercial houses, they're still one of the ones that will publish some of the major European names, and still some American poetry and fiction.
And all these that went to Minneapolis because Minnesota gives more money for
yes, but they're all non-profits.
Several publishers went to Minneapolis.
Yeah, because there's a lot of private foundation support, yeah.
But still my impression, maybe I'm wrong, you tell me, is that in Britain there are even fewer attempts to, translations of non-English literature than in America. There's a lot.
There are more.
Just
the other way around.
Yeah.
I was really amazed
The
last year.
figures for the UK, it really went up from 3% to 4.5%.
Okay, so it's changing. Because,
Plus the sales, they claim that the sales are increasing.
England.
Not just the sheer numbers of titles, but in terms of sales and visibility. But I was wondering about, I have to say I have this problem with the notion of translated literature in the English-speaking world. And I use it a lot in my sort of lobbying, when I have to lobby for, programs or funding for translations. And in my small international world of cultural policy makers, we use that notion of translated literature as if there is it equals quality literature, and it deserves additional support and visibility. But at this, and you're saying it's invisible and the numbers are small, but at the same time you have these international authors that are not really genre literature. For example, that the guy with the Danish, Knausgaard.
Yeah.
Who was at the Norwegian, with a name that is difficult to pronounce again for American readers, but it's a blockbuster in the US, and it
Yeah.
was everywhere in the big chains
Yeah.
with the poster and everything.
Mhm.
And it's not as popular outside the English-speaking world, actually.
Yeah,
I've
I
spoken to several people from different countries, and when I mentioned now,
What makes actually the
is it popular here? I'm not sure about that.
I'm sure.
Most of us have
I've
transcribed in
No, I've talked to
English.
Damian Yakov,
No, I reckon.
and he told me he has sold 123 copies overall since 2012, so that's the popular.
So it's the extent.
Whether he has read Austria,
123.
Yeah, just the first one, and he didn't go beyond that, so
Bulgaria.
now I'm considering going the one with it. But in Bulgaria, he's a publisher buster, he's not a blockbuster, it's quite the opposite. Any publisher that tries to take him on goes bust, because
but you know, he published him in a very secretive way, actually. It took me years to learn that the book had been published.
well,
in
true, but the
Bulgaria.
translation is good and the book is out there, so people, I mean,
They changed the title of his also.
I don't know what they're talking about.
Oh, it's-
Literally Mein Kampf,
But it's
Mein Kampf.
personal.
My personal strength.
Not to sound a bit.
differentiate it from Hitler's book?
yeah, but
I think so.
there is a rationale behind that.
Deliberately.
But I can't tell you why that, why it took off in America. I have no idea. I haven't read the work.
I mean,
I
there
only
are,
got the-
in the
yeah.
history of publishing, these are, cases like this, or Bolaño's breakthrough in America as well.
But there are not that many, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're almost.
That's why there are anecdotes and, mythology around.
Kind of accidental, I would say.
Ferrante or House Guard can become like names suddenly.
But what prepared America for that is Siebold, W.G. Siebold, right? But then he started, remember, he went to England, and with the immigrants, that changed. And then the person who comes after Siebold is this man, Krasnohorkai, Hungarian writer. And he's published by New Direction. And his books, and he was tied into the movies with Bella Tarmuid, like Satan Tango. Susan Sontag gave him the imprimatur, gave the imprimatur also to Siebold. But that's where, and what's in Krasnohorkai is popular in England. That's the thing that's even more astonishing, because they do really beautiful, and New Directions picked him up then. So I just wondered, like, does people in Bulgaria read Krasnohorkai?
Yes.
In English, right?
No, in Bulgarian.
No, do you translate from Hungarian?
The translations since the 90s. Yes.
Aha, but
We support it. No, I know. So there are 123 people
No, who published
read,
it?
who read.
Was he published? Has he been published?
In the 90s.
That's in the 90s.
Okay.
That's some years.
But apparently you don't know, so.
And as a Bulgarian publisher, how many books are you doing?
Oh, they are big books,
We do about 90 per year, of which about 65 to 70 Bulgarian, and about 20 to 25 in translation. And I should say out of that, about 25 to 30 books of poetry every year.
Very
We
good.
might be the single biggest poetry publisher in the country.
And
Bulgarian poetry
And contemporary Bulgarian
We would be
literature.
all that if not.
And coincidentally, everybody sitting in front of me here was published by us.
Very good.
It's,
very good.
I mean,
Yeah.
we didn't kind of organize it, it's
Yeah,
just
but-
coincidence.
just
So it shows you
If you're
that,
awesome, well, thank you for what you do.
About that.
Okay, from this
He
house.
produced his cast.
And actually, in the White Pine book, most of the things are also in 2007.
Okay. In your book.
And the Trust of Percent and so on are in fall. So.
but we have a funny business model. We make money from printing and we pour everything into the publishing, and that's how we lose it.
Oh, because you're also a printer.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so you don't take your books to a printer, you are the printer. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually.
Yeah, so that, I understand.
No, but historically printing was the big thing,
Of
the big
course,
business, the big business.
Because
we
you
gained
didn't print for
popularity
everybody,
because of
yeah.
the publishing, but printing was the big business.
Yeah.
So we made lots of money, and it didn't make. I mean, we didn't care. We did care, but if we lost some money
Yeah,
into publishing, it wasn't a big deal.
yeah.
But then
Because you were not
it changed.
expecting how much it was.
His mother has a very,
It's
his mother has very great book when she explains.
Oh, it used to be.
His
Yeah.
mother has a very,
what-
also has a very good book explaining the revolution times
What way had to change
for
though?
books.
It changed after the crisis because the money we make from printing is not enough
Ah,
to support the publishing. So the publishing had to go and break even on its own. So
yeah, okay, I see, yeah.
to be made sustainable in its
Yes,
own right.
Yeah, I understand.
So we
That's-
had
that was what I was
to
curious, yeah,
adjust, you know, the tiny
Yeah.
nuts and bolts, which I think we did. So we've
Yeah.
been going decently strong for the last 10, 11 years since the crisis.
Very good,
It's-
yeah.
yeah.
Good.
But
No,
you
just
started
curious,
the
'cause it's-
translation, huh?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
do
Yes,
translation.
yeah. We only did Bulgarian before I joined in 2006, and I started the international.
But imagine next to him how Paul is going to survive. I mean, it's
Yes,
I hope she survives. I know.
It's good that we are friends with Manuel.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's it.
Well, you survive by staying small.
These small ones, you know, because I killed mother.
Well, you survive by staying small and trying to advance and, yeah.
If it is
Do you
yeah.
think-
So, I guess if you allow me just
Yeah.
one last,
Yeah.
really a ignorant question. I'm always trying to, because this morning I was watching the Bulgarian book show.
TV show.
The TV show that is dedicated to books and reading in libraries. And again, there was a
You
conversation.
have one. We don't have it in America.
Yeah, we do it so many others still. But and there was a conversation about independence.
It was founded by the guy there in the back. wasn't
Yeah,
it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
He started the
The
death.
silent guy who, you know, does all the things.
The book show that was founded by the
This guy there that doesn't seem
They
rich, you know, he
changed
just
also the
wants
blend
to.
of, they changed everything, recently they changed the music and the
But you made the context.
But it's still there.
I
But
don't know the
yes, you were,
So
you
what
made
did
the
you see?
context
What
for
is it,
all
the
these
question?
things, you know?
They also changed this
The monastery.
In a nutshell,
So there was a
everything.
conversation about independent bookshops in Bulgaria, the good conversation, by the way. Anyway, but my example with Knausgaard, I guess, on the background of all this talk about Amazon and the big chains and the small printerance of the small presses and your zero budget for marketing and the fact that you can't really have a breakthrough without a marketing budget. Is that really so that it's just simply structurally impossible for a small independent publisher to have a...
It partly comes down to the thing we were talking about, the luck of like the people that sell, the Norwegian guy who sells thousands of copies. It comes down sometimes to getting a review in the right place or academics who pick it up. I mean, that may build an audience for it. And because it's in some, like our house is very small compared to Copper Canyon or Grey Wolf, or even, I mean, Chad's is even bigger budget because he's at a university that you've been open with.
And he's not doing poetry, that's a big...
Well, he does a little bit of poetry, but only maybe 25% or 20%. But because he's at the university, his big budget is bigger, but he still has to fight for reviews. And in America, it's difficult. Many newspapers used to do reviews of books, literature, and as the newspapers got crunched by economics because of the internet and everything, most of that has gone away. So most of the, even to get reviewed is online or in academic or literary journals. So it's very hard to, get reviewed and get attention.
I've heard, I'm still from 20th century guy, that recently self-publishing has become more, because, even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, self-publishing was not considered something very prestigious, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that it's still,
But
but it's
I
become more
hear
common.
that's managed to do it through, online publishing and so forth.
Right,
and-
right, and there are places you can go on because somebody, we were talking about this last night with somebody, like a press like ours or an online magazine or print magazine, you have an editor or curator who's deciding the quality of the work. So there's a certain aesthetic and whether you like that aesthetic or not, yeah. But with self-publishing, the writer, however good or bad they are, can just get their book published online or just, put it on Amazon or as an ebook. And most of that is not taken very seriously in the States. You've had some successes like, I assume you're familiar with 50 Shades of Grey,
Yeah.
which was made into a series of movies. That started out, the woman who did that was self-published it. And it sold, it just took off in the self-publishing probably because of the racy subject matter. But then she got picked up by a major commercial publisher because she was selling thousands of copies online herself. So a major house said, oh, we can make some money on this. And then of course the movie rights and they would get a percentage of that. So, but for every one of those, there's probably 50 or 100,000 people who have self-published who sell 10 copies or something to their friends or give them away and nobody's ever heard of them.
Just to add to that, the difference is that we tend to think that apart of 50 Shades of Grey and these individual cases, we tend to think that nobody is taking this stuff seriously.
Of course, and for good reason.
But no, it's just us not taking it seriously. This is being, I just wrote a report that we published with two other researchers on the situation in Europe in translations and bestsellers. We're following the bestsellers in Europe and also using Amazon statistics. That is very interesting. And most of the best-selling stuff is actually self-published nowadays. And we are talking millions of copies that in the traditional publishing world that we all come from is unbelievable. And the usual pathway is exactly the one of that woman with the 50 Shades of Grey. You self-publish, then there is a snowball effect on top of that, and then as she did and many other writers are doing that they get comments and reviews by readers and adapt the story and in a way co-write it.
And they're doing it through Twitter or Facebook or all that.
And you have the Netflix people monitoring that world all the time, for who's the most popular, and picking these authors straight away without any editor, bottleneck, any new directions, Giraud and Strauss, these do not exist basically, directly from the self-published platforms to the script writing for Netflix.
And that is not our world.
And we are aware that none of us is
more and more goes down and down. Also the quality of films and that they've started with very good edition.
Definitely that's the price of.
Walt Whitman published his book himself first, but how many people of this?
Most of the people, many started self-publishing.
But the romantic, precisely that romantic aura of samizdat is. We have to.
Now in Bulgarian there is, probably from Russian what is samizdat. But samizdat is completely different from self-publishing. Because samizdat is not you go to a publisher, to a printer and pay him or her to publish your book, but it is a book that publishes itself because Solzhenitsyn, for example, write 5 copies of a short story and give it to 5 friends, and they make 5 copies each, and in a couple of weeks it has thousands of copies circulation. So It's quite different.
It is actually the opposite.
Self-publishing.
The opposite, because contemporary samizdat is due to the lack of quality, because
Yeah.
somebody will publish it, and the old samizdat is because of too much quality. Too many qualities, as it were.
It's interesting, we have Olga Stepanova.
Maria.
Maria Stepanova, sorry. It's
grandmother
interesting,
is
we mentioned at least 5 Russian references today.
At least.
Mandelstam.
Mandelstam.
Of course, we have them.
Who spoke about it?
We can have more.
That was quoting Bulgarian.
Yeah, but the realization that everyone is writing as if breathing in a rhythm of
That's true.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful poem.
But it's also interesting with Russian, for example, that now you have Russian writers, specifically with poetry, writing in English, and sort of bringing the Russian avant-garde tradition of the 70s and 80s poetry into English. So there's like Evgeny Ostashevsky, for example, or Ilya Kaminsky, who are Russian born, but they bring into American poetry something that I associate personally with something that's like the Soviet avant-garde of the 80s, and I'm just curious whether sort of you're familiar with that scene.
I'm familiar with Ilya Kaminsky's work. He's just got a new book out in America.
Yeah, Death Republic.
Which is very good.
Which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Sort of almost like a play.
But he was saying from the Ukraine, not from.
Well, yeah, he's from Odessa, but back then he was Soviet Union.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah,
Yeah,
he would
yeah.
probably say it's Ukraine.
This is Russian, like Krim.
Translation.
Come on.
That's weird to hear from
So,
Is it me?
the
Okay.
moderator has a proposal for.
Well, yes. Maybe we should, if you want to say a couple more formal words, and then let's go and have a glass of wine.
Anyway, formally.
But it's.
But I think, Ilya Kaminsky is a good example of a voice that comes into American culture in translation, and he's writing in English. He maybe wrote the first book in his native language, I'm not sure.
He did write in English, I think. He started writing in English.
Yeah, so maybe the first book,
That book.
but so he became very successful with the first book, and only now, like 15 years later, comes the second book. But he's been very influential as a critic, and she's done some co-translating from Russian of some Russian poets, and also editing books. So his name is very familiar to a lot of poetry readers. And he's, it's just another voice that comes into the American stew, or whatever you want to call it, of voices. But I think it adds another quality to the work, and people will be influenced by his voice as they are by other European, Latin American, Asian writers.
In Bulgaria, I read Tom Phillips' small book, and I find it very, some of the poems are really much better in Bulgarian than in English. It's diverse, and I really enjoy it. I really enjoy it because you see the structures. Yeah.
Actually,
Yes,
he's
so,
actually funny because,
I book.
by the way, he was going to come this evening, but he called to say that he's sorry that he can't come, but Tom Phillips, he's a British poet who lives in Sofia now and publishes this magazine, Balkan Voices Today. And he did this experiment as he was learning or studying Bulgarian and learning so. He started writing poems in Bulgarian that are very simple, but as Sven says, they work in a strange way because
I don't know if Bulgaria through writing poetry.
exactly.
Nobody has
He's a
There is a.
I was thinking whenever I hear the name Joseph Brodsky,
That's the word she.
Let's keep on saying because let's see if it's another mythology.
It's not the right time yet, guys.
I was thinking, I was at Columbia in 1972, I think it was, and Brodsky came, and his first reading, and I went to it, was at the School of International Affairs. And what was astonishing to me and to all the Americans, he didn't have a book in front of him.
Exactly. It was
He
like
recited.
church, no?
He
was
recited.
reading like liturgy in
And
the
that
church.
was astonishing, and I think he pushed those other two Russian poets, the only two other Russian poets that Voznesensky and Yevtushenko, they suddenly got pushed to the side.
Shevchenko is too theatrical. Actually, Brodsky was a very good reader.
But he astonished people by him
He was like a
reciting.
priest. He was reciting like in a church.
Yeah, that was,
That's what
Yeah.
but he pushed aside those two other Russian poets because they were the darlings, like Voznesensky and Yevtushenko. And he changed, and also the connection to Sontag and Farrar Straus. So now, you know, he was around in the universities, and he also worshipped at the shrine of W.A. Jordan, of course. You know, and so that was the
He was
atmosphere.
also talking about Herbert a lot.
Yeah,
Herbert was less,
because he was
less
he's essentially, you know, very Christian.
Yeah.
You know, it's that Christian impulse that shows up in Mandelstam too. You know, but it was this astonishing. You know, no American poet has ever recited like that. They always had that book in front of them.
Right.
But Brodsky, although he was a great, prose, non-fiction prose writer, in English, his poetry in Russian is much, much better than
We just heard it in Russian. There was no translation. That came later. You know, that's
So it's another question. I mean, is it possible to, because there's so many, not so many, but there's some very great fiction writers who wrote, like Nabokov or Conrad, who wrote in non-native language. But I'm wondering if it's possible to
Well, Celan and Yandol and
well, Solan wrote in German, right? Also,
he had German records
and
and
he was, the German actually was his native tongue.
I guess we have to wrap up with
Well, one thing, support your local bookseller if you're interested in.
Yes, please, support the local booksellers. Support books, buy the books.
All of them?
Well,
One
you
by
only
one.
two anyway.
What do you mean on
No,
one?
whatever you pick.
Like to give one to a
The
friend.
French run is 2 copies?
Sorry?
No, there are more copies, but there are 2 books that you have to buy.
Okay.
Dennis book for sure, and then also
Ah, okay.
But buy copies for friends.
supporters. So she produces the next one.
Thank you all, it's been a very entertaining and interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dawaj. Dawaj, kupował
Chciałam zajmować
Also, the thing is,
Jak to kupować? Passam su una disciplina. Ja si proponiamo
So you were around now.
Виктор, извинявай, забравихме въпроса с интернета да